Hello, I'm the Dark Master, and welcome back to the Kirby Right Back at Ya Retrospective. In today's installment, we shall be reviewing episode 39, Escar-Gone, or as it's known in the Japanese original, Forgotten Escargoon! The episode was released originally in Japan on July 6, 2002 as the 39th episode, while in the 4Kids English dub, it was released on March 8, 2003 as its 36th episode. This was likely due to the changes in the release dates of other episodes, as opposed to anything wrong with the episode itself. Interestingly enough, in the now defunct Kirby TV channel, this episode is the only one to have a wrong thumbnail, interestingly enough. Now that we've covered these pre release subjects, let us start with the episode's plot. Right off the bat, we see a change between versions. In the English dub, there is an outside shot of a moon that is red and an outside shot of DDD's castle. The Japanese original starts directly with DDD ordering the monster of the week. Well, honestly, despite researching extensively, I have no idea where this footage came from. I assume the Halloween special Scare Tactics Part 1 or Part 2, or perhaps 4Kids just made it up to fill air. Seems like an odd thing for them to do considering they usually remove stuff, infamously so, as opposed to add anything, but I don't know, that's just kind of a little interesting, isn't it? In either case, we cut to King Dedede reading the NME Corporation catalog. We see the next change between versions here. In the Japanese original, we see the catalog has the English words catalog on it. 4Kids remove this perfectly clean English for really no reason at all. It's just so utterly bizarre as to why they would do that. He then orders what is described as a super dangerous monster by the sales guy, and via the power of reused animation, the monster teleporter begins to bring the monster in as DDD laughs manically. But the king is shocked upon seeing that the creature is barely the size of a firefly. This is Erasem, the monster of the week. Let us discuss him now, since he's being properly introduced here. In terms of design, it's rather odd being a sort of demonic insect alien aborted fetus, I guess. I can only assume John Morgan is the father, considering how malformed it is. Surprisingly, despite its young appearance, it can speak and is one of the most articulate monsters in the series that doesn't utilize a cover. In the Japanese original, it is voiced by Makiko Ohomoto, who is the same Japanese voice actress who does Kirby in both the anime and games. It's sweet, and she does a really good job. The English dub voice actress is uncredited, and so I don't really know who it is. I've looked deeply into it, scoring the pages of who voiced it, but like I just couldn't find anything. But whoever they are, they do a decent job too, for what it's worth. Overall, while I would not say he's the most physically scary monster, but he does have some terrifying powers that we shall see shortly. Erasem floats around and leaves the room, much to the king's bemusement. We see Erasem float down the hall, passing by Sword and Blade Knight, who notice and are confused at it, one of them thinking it must be some sort of weird firefly. Erasem enters into the room which belongs to Escargoon and Sensing the sleeping snail passes through his cheek. Escargoon feels this and wakes up for a brief moment, but assumes it was a nightmare due to his cheek falling asleep, and goes back to sleep. After the jazzy intro, we cut to the next day as we see Escargoon awakening. Refreshed, he brushes his malformed teeth, gets some fresh water to wash his face, and brushes his facial growths before looking into the mirror and saying that he's ready for the day. We cut to a groggy King Dedede, who enters into his throne room and is greeted by Escargoon, who is unusually happy cleaning his throne. The king, confused, asks what the snail is doing there. This represents another change between versions, as in the Japanese original, everyone refers to Escargoon as a sort of weird old man. 4Kids changed this to them calling him a snail, likely to avoid the negative connotations of the words weird old man has, which is honestly a good call considering today's climate when it comes to old men who are weird. DDD cautiously approaches the confused Escargoon and demands to know what he is doing here. Escargoon is taken aback as we see a view of Erasem in his stomach body cavity. Erasem then breaks the fourth wall and speaks directly to the audience, explaining its power, which is to make its victims become completely forgotten by people. Actually, extremely horrifying if you really think about it. I mean, imagine you wake up one day and absolutely nobody recognizes you. They all just have like some sort of collective amnesia. Think about how terrifying that would be. Escargoon assumes the king is joking, but the king says he's never seen Escargoon before in his life. Escargoon assumes that this is another joke, but King Dedede pulls his mustache and demands to know why the snail is here, and Escargoon explains he's doing what he's always done, that being working for the king. But the king says he's got enough morons working for him and throws him into the wall. Yes, the king is mighty strong. Escargoon is aghast at his treatment, considering all his service, but the king yells at him and calls for his guards at once. Waddle-Doo and a platoon of Waddle-Dees surround Escargoon. This makes the snail angry, who asks if they really mean this, which the loyalties nod their heads in agreement. Some have said that maybe they're immune to it, but I don't believe that. I think that's just a sort of error introduced in the Japanese original due to how the lines are delivered, and because the Waddle-Dees don't really talk that much. It doesn't really matter, but you know. Having had enough, Escargoon says he quits and walks out of the room, much to the confusion of both the king and Waddle-Doo, who comments on how unstable he is, while the king says he's quite nutty. Escar-Gone complains while walking down the hall as he passes by Sir Ibram and Lady Like, complaining about his fate. When he leaves, Lady Like asks her husband who that was, to which Sir Ibram says he has no idea, and we cut away from the two, who are not seen again in the episode. Escar-Gone leaves the castle, shocking the Waddle-Dees as he goes to the mayor's house. We go to the mayor's house. Escargoon tells him that it is a good idea to look for a job now. However, this leaves the mayor confused. The mayor asks if they met before, which shocks Escargoon, who is amazed. After all, he did to the mayor that the mayor doesn't remember him. But the mayor assures him that he hasn't ever seen him before and tries to be nice. Escargoon self-reflects and starts yelling belligerently towards the mayor, despite the mayor trying his best. This aggression prompts one of the sheep to hit Escargoon so hard he is literally sent flying into the town square. I'm shocked his shell didn't crack from either the hit or the impact on the concrete. Escar-Gone bemoans this before noticing Tuff and the Cappy kids staring at him. He asks if they remember him, and Tuff reasonably reacts as one would if some random guy fell from the sky. This leaves the snail dejected, and Tuff tries to cheer him up, but he is spurred away as Escar-Gone pauses his rant to look at Kawasaki. There we see the next change between versions here. As in the Japanese original, there are some kanji on the flags. Four kids airbrushed this off, and I won't really talk about it further as I said it in multiple previous episode coverages. But it seems like a rather superfluous instance of censorship that really didn't need to be done. And I gotta wonder, like, what the point was. Resuming with the plot, Escargoon desperately enters the restaurant. Hopeful that he would remember, he goes to get food, saying that he'll even eat Kawasaki slop at this point. He's so dejected. Kawasaki comments on how odd it is for a new customer to dislike his food. This shocks Escargoon, who believes the king has gotten the entire town to play this sort of sick prank on him and leaves, having a mental breakdown as Kawasaki is just confused there. Escargoon wanders down the street as everyone doesn't know who he is and sort of whisper rumors behind his back. Escar-Gone gets angry at all this commotion and storms off to the police station, shocking Chief Bookums awake, and asks if there is anything that he can do for the snail. A relieved Escar-Gone, believing for a moment that Bookums recognizes him, asks for Chief Bookums to arrest the townsfolk for conspiring against him, pointing at the confused crowd. The bemused police officer humors him, saying he'll have to fill out the form. Escargoon agrees but is angered when Chief Bookums asks for his name, and it is here we see the next change between versions in terms of dialogue. In the Japanese original, he starts making frustrated noises, which prompts Bookums to confusingly say that he just asked for his name, man. In the English dub, this is changed into Escargoon launching into a tirade of insults, causing Bookums to ask how to spell them, apparently mistaking these slurs for his actual name. Honestly, both versions portray an accurate reaction that someone in Escargoon's situation would have, though I do find the English dub's Chief Bookums reaction a little more humorous in either case. Escargoon leaves in a huff, with the police officer mumbling about listing the report under Jon Snail, which is a pun to the Jon Snow thing. Escargoon thus runs through town, sobbing uncontrollably. We then cut to Tiff and Meta Knight discussing Didi's recent purchase of a monster, with Tiff saying nothing has really changed. This conversation is cut short by Meta Knight, who hears Escargoon approaching, breathing heavily, and gets between him and Tiff. Escargoon pleads with Tiff and Meta Knight to know if they're not scheming with the king to prank him. Tiff, a bit confused, assures the confused snail that they never work with the king, and Meta Knight promises to assist him. Escargoon thanks them and apologizes for his past. Tiff is a bit confused by this and asks how they can help him. Escargoon explains what is going on, and Tiff, feeling great pity for him, goes over and hugs the poor guy, who thanks her a lot. Meta Knight then pulls Tiff aside for a brief moment, as Escargoon bursts into tears, saying she's such a nice kid. Meta Knight asks Tiff if she has any idea who the snail is, and Tiff admits she doesn't know and was just humoring him since he was so deeply sad. Meta Knight points out how the snail knew their names, but they do not know him. Tiff says he's insane, but Meta Knight says they should still keep an eye on him. However, Escargoon overhears part of their conversation and, passing the event horizon of depression, cries out in pain and runs off. Tiff says they should help him, but when they turn, they see that he has disappeared. Escargoon is seen running through the hills, wishing for someone to remember him. We see Kirby frolicking through the countryside. Eventually, the two bump into each other. Escargoon recovers shortly afterwards and calls out to Kirby, who reacts happily. Now, there have been two different interpretations of what exactly is going on here, and I'll explain them in a bit. So the two interpretations are as follows. Some have said that due to Kirby being supposedly created by Nightmare, he's immune to Erasem's power. Others have argued that Kirby really had their memory wiped, but due to their inability to speak and natural friendliness to strangers, Escargoon projected upon them some familiarity where there was none. Both these interpretations have their merits, and there never has been an official word either way, though I do lean towards the first one. But both are perfectly fine, and they're both very interesting to talk about. Regardless of which is the case, Escargoon hugs Kirby. Interestingly, in the background of this scene in the Japanese original, there is an arrangement of My Friend and the Sunset, which, for those who don't recognize the name, is a theme from the credits of the Revenge of Meta Knight subgame of Kirby Superstar. It honestly sounds really amazing. Just listen to it for a bit. We see Escargoon and Kirby relax on the beach. We see Escargoon comment on his fate. In the Japanese original, he's far more melancholy, spending a lot more time bemoaning his fate of being forgotten, and only takes solace in the fact that Kirby is the only one who will treat him as a friend. In the English dub, he reflects upon himself more and promises to take advantage of this clean slate to become a better person, and asks Kirby to help him do this, so that no one will ever ask who he is again, as he's had such a positive impact on everyone. Then Kind shows up, greets Kirby, and much to Escargoon's chagrin, asks who he is, causing the snail to faint. Kirby catches him as we fade to a commercial break. Afterwards, we cut to Chief Bookums as we see numerous Cappies looking over various pictures with Escargoon in it, confused at how the stranger seemingly got into these photos, with the mayor saying it's creepy, and Bookums suggested that they are forged. We then cut to King Dedede, who is looking through his own photo album, but stops when he sees Escargoon in one of the photos and is confused at how that old nutjob got in his book. He decides to ask the enemy sales guy, who explains that he did in fact order a monster called Erasem according to their records. Dedede is confused and says he never saw no monster and won't pay for something he didn't get. Then, the enemy sales guy explains that Erasem is one of the smaller monsters in their catalog, and Dedede is confused and looks into the monster catalog. We see a picture of Erasem, and for some unknown silly reason, the catalog number of 0279 was airbrushed out in the English dub. Just why? We then cut to Meta Knight, and he is shocked to hear of what Sword Knight and Blade Knight saw last night. They look at the room, but Meta Knight is confused by its presence and doesn't know who owns it. Tiff asks what is going on, and Meta Knight explains that he believes that they are facing a small but dangerous monster, Erasem. This shocks both Tiff and Sword/Blade Knight. Meta Knight explains to Tiff that Erasem erases his target from the memories of everyone, and the pair realize that they need to help that odd stranger, and they go to ask Tuff where is he. Tuff says he saw Escargoon on the beach with Kirby. Escargoon wishes someone would call his name. His wish is granted when he hears Tiff calling his name, as he and her brother run onto the beach. They offer the poor snail some tea and cookies. Escargoon is a bit concerned, hesitant that they might be yanking his chain, but Tiff explains that they saw his picture with Kirby, though really in the picture they're not really playing, they're more like trying to hit the poor baby, but whatever. Escargoon and Kirby do a little dance at the relevation, and then we cut to the group enjoying tea time, joined by Meta Knight, with Escargoon and Kirby helping themselves to the cookies. Escargoon asks a clarifying question of whether they actually remember him. Tim admits not really, but they figured it out thanks to the pictures. We also see another change between versions. We see in the Japanese original, Kirby repeats the phrase, "let's go" in Japanese. The English dub thankfully removed this. Honestly, Kirby speaking too much is just absolutely weird, and the less he speaks, the better. Tiff says that soon they'll remember everything, as both Escargoon and Tuff go to eat some of the cookies. Kirby, however, being Kirby, inhales them alongside the plates as well, with Tiff commenting on Kirby's lack of table manners. Meta Knight asks Escargoon if there was anything odd last night, and the snail, via flashback over Lane, explains that he remembers a nightmare where he had a light floating around his head. Meta Knight says this is bad, while Tiff explains to the confused snail that there is a monster inside him. Meta Knight says they'll have to remove the monster, where Escargoon is in denial that a monster could even be inside him. But Meta Knight says if they don't remove it, Escargoon shall be forgotten forever. Escargoon remarks that even he doesn't deserve such a fate. But Meta Knight warns that the procedure might be excruciatingly painful, that Erasem will not leave his body voluntarily. Tuff says Escargoon might chicken out, but Escargoon says he'll toughen anything out. We then cut to the dungeon as we hear Escargoon screaming in pain as he's being electrocuted. In the Japanese original, we see a shot of a skeleton, which was seen briefly in an earlier episode, episode 12, Escargoon Squad. I've already reviewed that, so go check that out. 4Kids airbrush this out, sadly. I don't really see the issue. I mean, Kirby games have had numerous skeleton-based enemies in the past, so, what's the issue now? In fact, we'll even see a skeleton-based enemy in the subsequent two-parter, that being Scare Tactics, that we will see later. Tiff covers her face to avoid the horrific scene as Kirby looks confused as Meta Knight activates the torture machine. The sound effect is changed between versions. In the Japanese original, it makes a sort of triumphant organ-like sound, while in the English dub, it makes a robotic sound effect. Allegedly, this was done to downplay the violent nature of the machine and to disassociate it from Meta Knight's actions. This doesn't really work as the machine still violently attacks Escar-Gone and we still see Meta Knight activated, so really what's the point? In the Japanese original, this whole scene is a great deal longer. We see Kirby helping wipe the sweat off Escar-Gone's head before Meta Knight activates the machine. We then see several gruesome procedures like Escargoon having his arms stretched nearly to the point of coming out of his sockets, a machine that begins punching Escargoon, leaving his face horribly malformed. The machine stretches him out even more with even more facial abuse. Kirby luckily gives him some water. Tuff and Tiff cheer him on as a machine grabs Escargoon and rotates him around like those training capsules used by astronauts to train. Surprised he's not vomiting. The English dub removed all but this very last scene. Honestly, I think the removal is bad, though, as it highlights how desperate Escargoon was that he underwent such torment. Erasem is ejected from Escargoon's mouth as the group cheer, though as Meta Knight stops the process, Escargoon is sent slamming into the wall. Everyone rushes over to him as their memories are regained. Kirby is happy and King Dedede enters the room,
What's going on down here?
Exactly what the heck is going on here. Dedede, seeing Escargoon sleeping, hits him right on the head with his hammer. Despite this, Escargoon is just happy to be remembered and faints. Dedede confused at his actions as Erasem approaches the group. Meta Knight and the others warn Dedede of its danger as Erasem floats out of the dungeon. Meta Knight says they have to chase the monster out of town before there's another victim as he, Kirby, Sword Knight, Blade Knight, Tiff, and Tuff chase after him. Dedede is confused and makes Escargoon up, saying that they gotta catch the monster before they send it away. Escargoon is just happy that the king remembers him. We then cut back to the police station as the adults, including Chief Bookums, slowly regain their memories. Kawasaki asks the reasonable question of why they are staring at photos of Escargoon. Before he can get an answer, however, they are interrupted by the sounds of screams outside. They exit to see what is going on as a fleeing mob of people who are running from a grave monster. Erasem is seen chasing after random cappies as a small crowd forces the adults back into the police station as Erasem floats by, seeming not to notice them as he could have easily gone straight through the door and cornered them. He begins chasing the group. We see King Dedede and Escargoon drive into town as a montage of Cappy say Escargoon's name. And he's honestly just happy to be remembered, but the king tells him to get over it. Erasem notices Escargoon and starts floating menacingly towards him. Escargoon pleads for mercy and Tiff orders Kirby to suck up Erasem, and he does so with relative ease. Though, of course, shortly after doing so, Erasem powers kicks in and everyone forgets Kirby, with everyone getting confused/aggressive, asking the poor baby various questions. Kirby is understandably greatly upset as the crowd asks him questions they should already know, and sadly, then, like a bad case of gonorrhea, Takori enters the scene to make some snide comment on how he always shows up in the end, breaking the fourth wall and shattering Kirby's mind. As the episode fades to black and we see that even the ending wipe doesn't seem to recognize Kirby, forcing Kirby to grab it in order to escape the black void. As he does so, he seems to cause Erasem to leave his body, and the episode properly ends with the monster saying goodbye to Kirby and the audience. Now that the plot is over, let us talk about the positives, the negatives, and my final thoughts. First, I want to say I just loved the story of this episode, and I loved how Escargoon was acting throughout the episode. I mean, he reacts like anyone would in such a realistic manner, being in cycles of confusion, anger, denial, depression, and rage. Sure, as some have pointed out, the plot is extremely similar to the famous Pottersville sequence in the 1946 film It's a Wonderful Life, made by Frank Capra. Though I would say that these two instances are so distant, it's fine, and both are extremely well done to the point where they both kind of stand out on their own merits, especially thanks to the talents of Ted Lewis as Escargoon. Erasem was also an amazing antagonist. While I would not go as far as the enemy sales guy did and say he's the most physically dangerous, I think the Broom King, Masher, and several others are far more physically dangerous. I would definitely say that on a broader level, Erasem is probably the most horrifying of monsters. I mean, just honestly, think about it. Imagine there being an entity that you can wake up one morning and, due to its influence, just make everyone forget who you are. And he does this intentionally, as we see that he leaves Kirby and Escargoon, and he takes joy in their suffering. Truly, it's just absolutely mortifying. I mean, imagine waking up and your own mother would look at you and say, "You are a stranger." That is horrifying. Also, unlike other monsters like Yamakage who survive but their final fates are ended up ambiguous and they just become these sort of unsatisfactory, unfinished loose ends, we actually see what becomes of Erasem as he shows up later in episode 46, Scare Tactics Part 2, so we at least know what he does later. It's really nice. Overall, while this is a good episode, however, I do have two issues with the episode that, sadly to me, keep it from being perfect. And no, for the record, the problems are separate from the censorship scene in this episode, though I do fundamentally have an issue with that as well, but it's a far more secondary compared to these other two big issues. The first issue I have is that while I love Escargoon's growth and part in the episode, and he does have a lot of sympathy, he doesn't really grow much from it. I mean, he's slightly nicer in later episodes, but it's barely noticeable unless you really pay attention. Some say that this is an issue with episodic formats, but I disagree. Star Trek The Next Generation was just as episodic as this show, but still managed to have some of the most beloved characters of all time that still to this day are being milked dry by untalented hacks. I do think that there is a balance between a purely episodic and a far more non-episodic format that, unfortunately, Kirby Right Back At You didn't really do that well. The second issue I have is slightly harder to explain, but please bear with me as I try. So this episode ends with a great deal of fourth wall breaking jokes by a trio of characters. These include Kirby, Erasem, and the wretched, horrible bird Takori. And It was admittedly relatively unfamiliar when this episode was originally released back in the beginning of the 2000s, and when I was a kid, I found it extremely humorous. However, nowadays I find it far less so. It seems now, however, that in our current postmodernist dystopia of a current art world, it seems like every show, whether it's live action or animated, has one of these gags every other episode or so. And before any hipster douchebag with problem glasses and a worthless college degree, who frankly deserves to be in student debt like Dire Gentleman, says that this isn't the very first instance of this happening. Congratulations for making an argument against something I never said really makes you feel better without having to actually listen to what is being said. It has existed, but I feel like it was always sporadic, like one episode of a series. Like when that one episode of Smurfs where Papa Smurf said some words about like the folly of man towards the end of one episode. And honestly, the fact that it only happens in this one episode does mean it's technically sort of like that. Though the fact that it happens three times concurrently is just, once by Kirby, one by Erasem. Though that one kind of makes sense, as it is meant to be like a very intelligent animal. But then one by Takori. Of all people, just what a sour note to end on. Like, I miss the earnesty from a lot of old pulps and comics that didn't really rely on cheesy pop culture references and irony to sell copies, like a lot of modern shite does. For the record, there is some solid stuff out there, like Nick Anderson's Planet Ripple or my brother's upcoming webcomic. It's just so rare nowadays, though. But enough about that. Overall, I think this episode is really good. It's definitely on the upper half of the echelon, if I had to be honest. But sadly, due to the flaws I mentioned earlier, I feel uncomfortable giving it any more than a silver ranking, if I'm being honest. I'd still recommend watching it, but it's not a priority as much as, say, other episodes in the series. Anyway, I'm the Dark Master, and join me next time on the Kirby Right Back at Ya Retrospective, and subscribe if you want to see more. Have a wonderful day.